Introduction to Culture, Chapter 3, Part 1 of 3. The objective of this presentation is to introduce you to social practices common to all cultures, variations that distinguish one culture from another, and the basic elements that make up a culture. This presentation will focus on the following concepts: defining culture and introducing the basic elements connected to culture. We will discuss the expansion of culture. We will explore different types of culture. We will examine the importance of language and the influence of language on culture. We will focus on social norms and their classifications. And finally, conclude our presentation by exploring the concept of dominant ideology. What is culture? Culture is a learned set of ideas and rules about appropriate behavior shared by a group. It's passed on from one generation to the next, not genetically per se, but rather through language, ideas, and rules, including social customs, knowledge, artifacts, material objects, values, and other artifacts. In sociological terms, culture does not refer entirely to the fine arts and refined intellectual taste. Sociology looks at culture through all its objects and ideas within a society. For example, an Andy Warhol portrait, a tattoo piercing, or hairstyle are all considered aspects of culture. Each group of people has a distinctive culture with its own unique version of collecting and preparing food, building their homes, creating families, and encouraging standards reflecting what is considered right and wrong. By acknowledging society as being the largest form of a human group, we can see one of the more obvious purposes of culture, which is a means to separate or categorize members of a society. Society is defined as a group who lives within the same territory and is relatively independent of people outside their area and who participate in a common culture. The U.S. is a classic example of a society. Within our borders, we house many cultures, and even though they all have their own cultural expectations, each will acclimate at some level to societal norms for the sake of cultural stability. In order for us to further understand culture, we should consider some of the more common features displayed in all cultures. The first feature we'll examine is cultural universals, which are common practices and beliefs exhibited in all societies. Most cultural universals are results of adaptations in order to meet essential human needs such as food, shelter, and clothing. Although the contents of each culture are different, each culture has specific ideas of language or a way to communicate, ethics or concepts of right and wrong, social roles of each member's rights and responsibilities per gender and age class, and the supernatural, the realm of supernatural beings, styles of bodily decoration, styles normally indicate identity, family structure, marriage customs and rules for inheritance, sexual regulation, such as incest taboos and marriage customs, and food preferences, which is ideas of what's appropriate for consumption at various social gatherings. The expression of cultural universals will vary from one society to the next, and within a society can change dramatically over time. Each generation and each year, for that matter, most human cultures change and expand. The next feature to consider is referred to as ethnocentrism, which is defined as a universal human reaction that has a tendency to assume that one's culture and way of life represents the norm or is superior to all others. Everyone learns ethnocentrism while growing up. The possessiveness of the small child quickly translates into my toys are better than your toys. Parents typically will outwardly discourage their children from such actions, but privately reassure their offspring that their possessions are indeed very nice. Much of the learning of ethnocentrism is indirect and unintended, but some of it is deliberate. History, for example, is often taught to glorify the achievements of one's own nation, and religious, civic, and other groups disparage their competitors openly. Among adults, ethnocentrism is simply a fact of life. The last feature we'll discuss is cultural relativism. For some, cultural relativism is somewhat of the opposite of ethnocentrism. While ethnocentrism compares foreign cultures to their own perceived superior culture, cultural relativism views foreign cultures from the perspective of the foreign culture. So why is cultural relativism important? Well, it's important because when taking into account philosophical moral views, it's vital to remember that different cultures have different views on what is moral and what's immoral, especially if you're trying to find one absolute moral rule or law or truth. For example, what is morally permissible in one culture may not be morally permissible in another. Take, for instance, cannibalism. Say there are tribes in Africa that believe cannibalism is morally permissible so long as it's not from your own tribe. To us, that sounds horrific. Cannibalism is not only immoral but also illegal. Keep in mind, though, that just because something is illegal does not necessarily make it immoral, and vice versa. Taking into account the difference in cultures allows us to view this act with less horror and more with a critical inquiry, which is important when searching for that ever-elusive absolute truth. In this next section of the presentation, we will examine two of the social processes, innovation and diffusion, that are involved with the constant expansion of culture. Innovation is defined as a process of introducing a new idea or object into a culture. Sociologists are interested in this process primarily for social consequences. What is the social reaction and why? There are two forms of innovation: discovery and invention. According to text, discovery is defined as making known and sharing the existence of an aspect of reality. Examples of a discovery include fire or a new moon of Saturn. Once a discovery has been made, the process continues and ends by sharing the newly discovered knowledge with others. In contrast to discovery, inventions are created by combining existing cultural items to form something new or that did not exist before. Examples of an invention would include the steam engine, the telephone, the microchip, or even democracy. So, how are cultures expanded to other societies, and what are the consequences? More and more cultural expressions and practices are crossing national borders and having an effect on the traditions and customs of the societies exposed to them. Sociologists use the term diffusion, which is a process by which a cultural item spreads from group to group or society to society. An example of diffusion, with which most of us are familiar, is the global expansion of McDonald's fast food restaurants and Disney World amusement parks. The most common means of diffusion today came from the invention of the internet. This form of technology has provided the means to be connected with an endless amount of descriptive information, people, groups, and organizations. Diffusion is created by merely typing in or touching a screen, exposing ourselves and others to a connection the likes of which no other era has experienced. So, what are some of the consequences of diffusion? Diffusion has the ability to expose us to a wider expression of human behavior. With this being said, expression can be perceived as being both a positive and a negative. For example, cultures scatter when there's an economic hardship of widespread proportion. This can be observed with the Irish potato famine, which caused thousands of Irish to migrate to the United States looking for a better life. Upon arrival, the Irish then scattered throughout the United States, bringing with them many cultural differences such as food customs, folk ideas, and even political ideologies. The result was the diffusion of many Irish cultural norms across the United States. Cultures are often subjected to ethnic and political persecution. The events in Iraq and Libya are prime examples of governments of bicultural countries that persecute individuals because of their ethnic identities. When the persecuted seek asylum in other countries, they bring with them hundreds of years of cultural practices that are then diffused into a new country or region. This is the end of Chapter 3, Part 1. There are 3 parts to this presentation. Be sure to view all 3 parts.